Thank you. Thank you. Is this the one? Thank you. Good morning to everyone. As some of you may know, yesterday the idea was we were supposed to have a kind of a back and forth discussion with another great speaker and of course with our fantastic moderator here. Obviously that didn't happen for reasons that I think everyone is aware. I just thought I was so lucky the other week to escape the microscope outage on my flight from Ibiza to Barcelona, and it was so, wow, I was so lucky. And now the next thing I know, I arrive here in the Philippines, and I said, just if only I arrived a day earlier here, I would have avoided so much hassle. It took me more time to go from Manila to Cebu than all the way from Europe to Manila, right? So it was a crazy situation. So if I'm not at my sharpest, please accept my apologies. I was asked very generically to discuss geopolitics, and I say usually that's a course in university we teach, but let's make it 20-25 minutes for the purpose of today. And from the Philippine perspective, because I think that was what I was supposed to do yesterday. Now, if you see some sort of vlogger stuff there, please don't mind it. The idea there is that even if just 4 people watch your stuff, as long as you got it on a vlog, then later on hundreds of thousands of people can look at it. Geopolitics. Well, you may not be interested in geopolitics. You may not even know what is geopolitics. Well, it's geography meeting politics, international politics, but it is interested in you, especially if you're a frontline state like the Philippines, which we'll show later on in a number of images. When it comes to discussions of US-China rivalry, and the discussion today actually I'm going to present is a kind of a condensed version of the talks I gave at Berkeley, Stanford, and earlier at Auckland University, but I'm going to simplify it because we're in a kind of a business environment and we want to get on with our life and lunch later on as soon as we can. The usual pedestrian way of looking at it is, what team are you? Are you Team America or Team China, right? For me, it's not about choosing, it's about juicing, right? Who are you going to juice between the two powers? Or if you're smart enough, where you can juice both sides for your own purpose. And the reason I talk in such a realpolitik manner is because the great powers also talk that way, right? Who's going to be our little guy here? Who's going to be our proxy here? How are we going to play them against each other? Obviously, some empires couch that in the language of democracy promotion. Some other empires couch that in the language of win-win cooperation, right? But at the end of the day, what we're seeing are 50 shades of empire, right? And some versions of empire are always more acceptable than others. And last time I checked, this country was part of the American empire 100 years ago, but some would say still. So let's discuss the art of hedging. Hedging is a concept that should be very familiar to you guys in the world of business, right? You don't put all your, investments into a single portfolio. You try to diversify your portfolio as much as possible, right? Because you want to hedge against possibilities, against uncertainties. And in geopolitics, we also have a similar situation because you don't want to choose between this side or that side. Here in Southeast Asia, we had horrible experiences during the Cold War period when Soviet Union and the United States were battling for influence here. It became even worse later on when the Chinese and Vietnamese also went at it. So we are very traumatized in this part of the world and we don't want to repeat the same experience. That is why hedging is the de facto option for practically all of us in this part of the world. But it is 50 shades of hedging because the Cambodian situation is much different from the Philippines. Cambodia is just right next to the Chinese border. The Cambodians are very economically dependent on China in ways that Philippines is not. We, to put it nicely, we have, if there's a tyranny of distance, we have distance from tyranny, right? There's enough distance in the Philippines and border of certain friends, right? Although they pretend to be our immediate neighbor because they're claiming almost entire South China Sea. And we are a US ally, obviously. And we have a much more diversified economy in the sense that we're not dependent on investments, let's say on China, in as much as, let's say, Cambodia is dependent on China in terms of trade, investment, and aid. So that gives you different kinds of portfolios, right? So now I'm making this as relatable as possible. So very quickly, when it's all about hedging, it's something that is asymmetric, meaning when you deal with 2 superpowers or 4 superpowers for that matter, it's not like you can be 30 here, 30 here, 30 here. It's going to be imbalanced. And more importantly, it's going to be reversible. It's going to be dialectical. So maybe 4 years ago, it was possible to have this kind of mix of relationship with US and China, you cannot have that tomorrow or 2 years or 10 years from now when this is a number one economy and this is no longer the number one economy, right? Or if this country has another Trump, or this country has another, well, no more Biden, let's say Kamala Harris, or if China has a different kind of leadership. So it's a constant wrestling, it's a constant jiu-jitsu, right? So the problem with a lot of people is that the pedestrian discussion assumes that the strategy that worked 5 or 10 or even last year would work forever. That's not how it works. If you don't want to believe me, just go to Singapore, which is known as a kind of a master of hedging. But even the Singaporeans are scratching their head nowadays because they realize what Lee Kuan Yew could pull off, or Lee Hsien Loong could pull off back in the day, cannot be pulled off by the current leadership. And they're doing their own recalibration. Bounded agency, that's very important. Again, it always annoys me when I give talks in Washington, D.C. or Berlin or Beijing, well, not as much Berlin anymore, where the discussion is as if Southeast Asia is just like, a bunch of, pieces of the puzzle and how we can play these little countries against each other. We're not little countries here. Last time I checked, the Philippines has as many people as Mexico, right? Our population is almost the same. I heard a lot of things about Mexico, but not them being a small country, right? So we are not small countries here. If you look at Indonesia, almost 300 million people. Philippines and Vietnam, 100 million people. We are at the very least mid-sized countries. And with that size and economic profile comes a degree of agency, all right? We can play our cards too. We may not have as many chips and cards as other countries, but we have something to play with. And that is a very important thing to keep in mind. Nevertheless, it's bounded. It is not perfect. It's not 100%. It's limited compared to, let's say, a superpower country. But you have to play it smartly. How are you going to juice it? By not choosing, right? That's the strategy, and that's the challenge for a lot of us. So I'm not going to bore you guys with the academic literature, but the whole idea is that it's an insurance-seeking strategic behavior. Again, something that will be very familiar to you in the business world. It is conscious, and at the same time, it's instinctive. Instinctive meaning, I don't want to be just a puppet of America or puppet of China. That's quite instinctive among a lot of ASEAN leaders. At the same time, it's also conscious in the sense that you can have a grand strategy, or just short of a grand strategy, a kind of a statecraft in order to do that. Now, having said that, there's going to be variation. Let's say, I think Vietnam and Singapore clearly have a much more coherent foreign policy bureaucracy. And with, not having really competitive election comes a degree of also continuity that you're not going to see in more fiesta-like democracies like the Philippines. So in some places, this hedging is a little bit more, in Tagalog we say sabog, all over the place. Or some would say, Duterte, you can have a long conversation about that. But in other countries, it could be actually more properly calibrated and curated. But nevertheless, I think the instinct is the same among all of us in this part of the world. Now, what are the preconditions for hedging? You can only hedge when, there's no all-out war. The moment all-out war is a distinct possibility, or it's already happening, you cannot say, I'm going to be neutral. So for geniuses who say, no, we should be neutral when China invades Taiwan, that's not going to work. Because the moment that war happens, the United States is going to expect us to be a treaty ally because we're a treaty ally, and vice versa, right? So when wars happen, it's close to impossible for smaller or medium-sized countries even to completely hedge. We saw what happened to Belgium, right, during the World Wars, right? Some of the countries that tried to be neutral back in the day, just Finland and Sweden dropped off their centuries-old neutrality after the war in Ukraine happened. So hedging can only happen short of a situation of all-out war or a direct or distinct possibility of war. Therefore, my presupposition here is there'll be no war, no major war between the two superpowers in the foreseeable future, despite all the blah, blah, blah. I spent a lot of time in Taiwan. I was a visiting fellow there. Obviously, we are concerned about the possibility of war in Taiwan, but I think it is still in the realm of possibility rather than probability, right? And therefore, it makes sense to talk about hedging. Now, just to give you an idea, hedging comes in many versions, right? So nowadays, the prince of hedging is supposedly Vietnam. Of course, the gentleman on the right side, he just passed away a few days ago. So Vietnam is seen as a kind of a master of bamboo diplomacy. One day they're meeting Vladimir Putin, next day they're meeting Xi Jinping. In fact, over the past 12 months, Vietnam became the only country to have heads of state visits from Russia, China, and the United States. The three most powerful militaries, at least in the world, right, visited Vietnam. It just tells you the level of dynamism and at the same time, the hedging, right, behavior of the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese have a strong relationship with Russia that extends way into the Cold War period. They have a relationship with China that extends way into the founding of the Communist Party of Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh's name actually comes from a Chinese, Ho Chi Minh. And also, their former enemy, the United States, is now their best chance to be less dependent on both Russia and China, economically vis-a-vis China and militarily wise vis-a-vis Vietnam. And so this is the game that the Vietnamese are playing. India has a different term for it. Their term nowadays is multi-alignment. It used to be non-alignment during the Nehru period, but now under Modi and the more assertive version of India, they talk about multi-alignment. Essentially having the cake, many cakes, and eating all of them at the same time, right? And so far it's working for India, right? They're gaining more and more access to strategic assets in the United States, including cooperation and development of engines for fighter jets with Boeing. At the same time, they are buying oil dirt cheap from Russia. In fact, at some point, India became the top importer of Russian oil. And from what we understand, they actually refine Russian stuff and then resell it to Europe, despite all the sanctions on Russia by Europe. And at the same time, if you look at India, they're very careful in managing their relationship with China, precisely because of their border disputes, and they don't want that to get out of control. So therefore, you see India joining the quadrilateral security grouping with US, Australia, and Japan. But whenever there's a strong statement on China, the Indians are not in the room. It's more the three other US allies and the United States together. So they played that card very well. If you want to better understand it, look at the back and forth, not back and forth, but Munich Security Conference in 2022, there was a quad meeting. I asked a question at Foreign Minister Jaishankar about this, and look at his response. He was like, no, this is just essentially a tactical, not even alliance, right? It's a partnership, right? So this is the Indian way of approaching multi-alignment. So the question for the Philippines is, can we do what Vietnam and India is doing? Because a lot of our friends are saying, why are we even a US ally? Forget about it. Let's just go on our own. Let's do Vietnam. Let's do India. Well, I'm not sure about that, because to begin with, we have a completely different geography from those two countries, not to mention we have a completely different sets of assets and liabilities. Our portfolio is completely different from India, which has 10 to 15 size of the Philippine economy and Philippine population, or Vietnam, which has already a very robust military, thanks to decades and decades of conflict. And by the way, it's a communist country, so they have party-to-party relationship with China, which the Philippines obviously doesn't have. And their geography is totally on the other side of the South China Sea Basin. So that is why you have to be very careful when you make recommendations. Oh, let's just copy country X, Y, and Z. When you're comparing here, actually apples and oranges. Completely different cases here, right? And different traditions. And by the way, hedging is not risk-free, right? With any kind of risk avoidance, you're also engaging in some form of risk-taking, right? So the Philippines, by hedging, we're also taking certain risks. But just to give you an idea about how fortunate or no longer so fortunate the Philippines is. So for a long time, we have been saying that Philippines is so lucky because we're at the crossroads of different continents and empires and all of that. Some would argue that globalization, as we know it, started in the Philippines thanks to the galleon trade. It was thanks to the galleon trade that for the first time, Latin America, North America was connected with the rest of the world. And that was done via Manila, the galleon trade. So for a very long time, we had this complacency that because we're surrounded by waters, right? We can be a trading hub, but at the same time, we don't have direct land borders with other countries. And that gives us a sense of complacency, in my opinion. But today, that sense of complacency has essentially flown out of the window. Because with massive navies operating around us, especially China's, you have to think twice. So actually, if you look at US-China competition, it is most stark. The parameters of that competition is most poignant in our part of the world. To be more specific, the Philippines is actually sandwiched between two areas of maritime competition between the United States and China. The so-called First Island Chain, which extends from all the way north in East China Sea. So this is the Senkaku-Diaoyu disputes, Taiwan Straits, and the whole South China Sea Basin. If you look at the Philippines, we're immediately there. But the other area of competition is the so-called Second Island Chain, which covers key areas of the Western Pacific. There's actually even a third area, third island chain. If you go to New Zealand, they'll show you the map. That's the South Pacific, when there's some competition happening. But I don't think it's anywhere as close, intense, and potentially armed confrontational as we have in First Island Chain and Second Island Chain. As we speak, there are Chinese submarines passing through the Philippine Sea. As we speak, there have been more and more war games being conducted and designed in the First Island Chain, including between China and Russia. And then on the other hand, you have Philippines doing quadrilateral patrols with Australia, Japan, and US. So a lot of activity here, and this is where the parameters of US-China competition is most stark than anywhere else on Earth. Think about any other conflict, it doesn't come close to this. You have the Taiwan flashpoint, you have the South China Sea flashpoint, you have the East China Sea flashpoint, and then you have US-China competition in the broader Pacific as China pushes out and tries to push the United States out of this part of the world. From the Chinese perspective, this is totally natural for them because they said any empire in history, if you look at any maritime empire, the first thing they did was to dominate their own adjacent waters. The Romans did that in the case of Mediterranean by completely genociding the Carthaginians out of pages of history, right? You can check. And in the case of America, it was the Monroe Doctrine, but part of the Monroe Doctrine was also dominating the Caribbean, and eventually they ended up here in the Philippines. And they kept pushing out until they're in Hawaii, next thing you know, they're here in the Philippines. So from the perspective of the Chinese, why shouldn't we have the same cushion, this perimeter of control? And that's where the first and second island chain comes in. I'm not justifying what China is doing. I'm explaining what is their thinking. It is not like out of this world imperialism. It is not, and it's actually, ironically, it is inspired by Western history, including the thoughts of Alfred Thayer Mahan, the American naval strategist that in the late 19th century told America, you're not going to be a world power unless you become a maritime power and you dominate your adjacent waters. So, very shortly, I'm going to go through this. This is not a lecture on the South China Sea. Just to give you an idea, on one side, you see the Kowtown shape. That's China's claim of almost 85% of the South China Sea. On the other side, you see what the international law is supposed to tell you, right? Which is, no. You cannot just go in there and claim because my ancestor 1,000 years ago passed through that area that belongs to me. It doesn't work that way. Maybe for Putin it works that way, but it doesn't work that way in modern international law. But the problem is China has the naval and economic influence to kind of operationalize that kind of expansive claim in this part of the world. And we saw the Chinese also over the past 10 years doing all of these massive activities, militarization of these fake islands, creating fake islands, and more warning, using huge armada of militia forces to enforce their claim. Now, it is true that, again, it's true that China is not the only country to militarize or fortify some of these islands. In fact, it's not the only country to fortify or militarize the disputed features. But just look at what China is doing. So these large ones you see here, these are fake Chinese islands, and then that's the rest by the other countries, either fake or natural. So this is essentially like NBA versus PBA versus barangay basketball. It is not even comparable. So because our Chinese friends always do this whataboutism, but what about you? You're also, yeah, but this is what we build. That's what you build. It's not comparable. It's like Shaquille O'Neal versus me, right? It's just not comparable, right? And this is why countries in this part of the world, especially smaller countries like Vietnam and the Philippines, have an interest in US being involved because you're facing such an asymmetry in power, which is impossible to close the gap with so-called diplomacy. Yeah. And the fear really here is what China is trying to do is to create its own sphere of influence in our part of the world, similar to what they had in the pre-colonial period, right? Again, it's a long conversation we can have about this, but I'm just talking about the sensibilities nowadays. Because when Chinese diplomats visit South Korea or Taiwan and Japan, people in those countries tend to tell you they come as if they're the envoys of the Chinese Ming Dynasty's emperor. The way they talk down to our presidents and prime ministers. That when a Chinese minister comes in, he expects almost parity with a Japanese prime minister or a South Korean president. And they feel this is the same treatment they were getting back in the day in the 14th, 15th century, right? When they were still Choson Empire or pre-Tokugawa Japan. And Vietnamese would tell you the same thing, that they have been fighting this fight for 1,000 years. And now in the Philippines, we're also feeling the same thing, this kind of a new tributary relationship that China wants to establish. Of course, they call it nowadays win-win cooperation. What is mine, what is yours, we share, right? That's their idea of cooperation. My waters, off limit. Your waters, let's go for win-win cooperation, right? And probably a lot of people in their marital experience can relate to that, but that's how China relates to geopolitics nowadays. What is mine, what is yours, we share. Now, in the case of the Philippines, let's just be brutally honest about it. We have been too dependent on America more than any other country. I can only think about, for instance, Israel, which has been relying a lot on the United States, but they have built their massive military capabilities over the past decades. This has not been the case in the Philippines. We were an American colony, and as some sort of a new colonial relationship persisted even way after we were handed our independence towards the end of Second World War. We just have to be brutally honest about it. In fact, the Philippines effectively outsourced. And when I say Philippines, I'm talking about our oligarchs and political dynasties, not the ordinary people like us. They essentially outsource external security to the United States via all of these basing agreements and security agreements. And that explains largely why the Philippines did not develop the kind of military industrial capacity and capability that you see in a lot of similarly sized or similar American allies for that matter. And the interesting thing here is the Philippines at the same time has always been expecting the US to be there for us whenever we're trying to do something, including when we're trying to occupy more and more land features in the Spratlys. Just to be very clear about it, the position of the United States is they're neutral on the disputed land features, right? Meaning they're not going to take any claim and not going to side with any side. But the reason behind that is because they were scared back in the 70s that we'll drag them into war so that we can bully smaller countries and get those islands from them. Because in the 60s and 70s, the Philippines still had the most developed military in this part of the world. And Marcos Sr. back then was the one who built our first military facilities in the Spratlys and all. So Henry Kissinger back then said, no, we're not going to allow these Filipinos to weaponize our mutual defense treaty to drag us into this. The problem though is by 2012, or even 1995, the Philippines was not the same country anymore. Devastated, bankrupted, polarized, and so much and so forth. But the US had the same policy nevertheless. And that explains why, when the Scarborough Shoal happened in 2012, or the Mischief Reef crisis happened in 1995, the US did not help the Philippines, right? Because they didn't upgrade that policy with respect to the realities on the ground. And in the case of the Philippines, we unwittingly expected the Americans to be there for us. True and true, when in fact it was not in America's interest to get involved in any of these conflicts. So if you look at it from 2012 onwards, effectively over the past 10 years, we're seeing a gradual awakening of the Philippines to our own new geopolitical reality. That US is no longer the dominant power it used to be, that China is the new power in the neighborhood, and that the Philippines will increasingly have to rely on its own and build its own capability and actively leverage its alliances and partnerships to defend its own interests. So we went from a passive, almost new colonial relationship with the United States to a much more active, self-conscious, what I call now emerging middle power country, right? And that's what we're seeing. Now, with more awareness and more assertiveness also comes more experimentation. So I think the most charitable way of understanding Philippine foreign policy over the past decade is experimentation. The Aquino approach was to bring in more Americans to push back against Chinese, but at the same time also bring in Japan and other countries. In fact, President Aquino paid more visits to Japan than the United States. I think he had 7 or 8 visits to Japan, and he actively sought Japanese help. His idea was we cannot just rely on the Americans. More importantly, President Aquino also pushed for legal warfare against China by pushing our case to the arbitral tribunal award in The Hague. So that was a form of experimentation. But most importantly, under President Aquino, we pushed for modernization of the armed forces of the Philippines for the first time in almost a generation. That's why for first time in 20 years, suddenly we had modern fighter jets, our FA-50s from Korea, which is just like an upgraded trainer. But that was just the beginning. So if you look at the Philippine vessels, warships, before 2012, and then compare it to the last 5 to even 10 years, you see a dramatical change. So we went not from 0 to hero, but we went from 0 to 5 at least, right? And part of that progress was the awakening we had after the Scarborough Shoal, when the US was not there for us and China really pushed the envelope in ways that really shocked us into realization of the new geopolitical realities. And then you had the Duterte experience. The Duterte experience was also interesting. Again, I'm trying to be fair to each of this administration. Duterte's understanding was very different. His idea was the future belongs to China. It's just a matter of time before China becomes the hegemonic power in this part of the world. US is a passé. Remember, this is the whole post-2016 elections in the US, polarization, isolationism. So let's invest in a future with China as early as right now while we have some sort of leverage. And therefore, let's not assert our claims as much. In exchange, let's get economic benefits. That was the wager of Duterte. Except the problem with Duterte was that he's a very skilled politician, but he's a very poor diplomat and even poorer geopolitical thinker. He was extremely naive about China. In fact, the parallel I see with Duterte is General Aguinaldo, right? Who towards the end of the 19th century, he tried to get American help against Imperial Spain, not knowing that the Americans had their own designs on the Philippines, right? So he brings in the Americans to kick out the Spanish, and next thing he knows, the two cut their deal and kick out the Filipinos, essentially, the revolutionaries. So he kind of had that kind of aguinaldo naivete, that kind of a provincial, parochial mindset, which failed to appreciate the broader geopolitical landscape and all of that. So I know some people will say he was a Manchurian candidate or something going on, but I think there was also an element of honest mistake on the part of President Duterte, to be fair to him. Now, obviously, that gamble also didn't pay off, because the best he got was not even debt trap. As you know, what is debt trap, right? Debt trap means China invests massively in your country, you're embroiled in debt, and then they get... No, China didn't make any major investments at all. I call it pledge trap. China just made empty pledges of investment, and Duterte naively just forwardly deployed all sorts of concessions. We're going to cut down cooperation with the US, we're not going to assert the arbitration award, we're not going to assert our claims in international fora. So obviously that experience also failed, which brings us to Marcos Jr. As you can see, I'm really squeezing this in. You know, I probably just 1,000 articles I've written about this, so you can check this on their own. Now, just to be fair to Marcos Jr., it's not like the guy came in also with the kind of downloaded software of how to deal with US-China competition. I'm showing to you how each of these administrations were struggling with moving tectonic plates, right? Like the ground was shifting as they were thinking. That's the difficulty of being a leader of a country on the front line, like the Philippines nowadays. If you look at Marcos Jr., in fairness to him, early in office, he tried to have also a balanced relationship with both sides. So immediately, he ended all that Duterte anti-Western bashing. He met the American representative. Back then, we didn't even have a US ambassador because of all the problems with the Trump administration's State Department. But he met them, no more cussing at America, and President Marcos Jr. made it very clear that we will assert our arbitration case in the South China Sea. So clearly, he's not going to be Duterte 2.0. But at the same time, he had a series of meetings with top Chinese officials. And during his meeting with Wang Yi, their foreign minister, he said, we want to move into a new golden age of bilateral relationship. And when he had his conversation with President Xi Jinping, he also said we want to shift our bilateral relationship to new heights. So he wanted to have that classic hedging, right, of having the cake of American and Chinese relations and juicing it out at the same time. But the difference with Marcos Jr. was this. Marcos Jr. already had the prior experience of Duterte, which is China makes a lot of pledges of investment, but nothing comes in. That's why 4 months into office, the Marcos administration suspended multiple Chinese projects which had no funding whatsoever. They were just empty on the paper projects. So the Chinese promised him, don't worry, come over Beijing, which by the way was his first state visit. So Marcos visited Beijing ahead of Washington, D.C. and Tokyo. And that was a state visit, the highest level. He was expecting to get something from China, but he didn't. China offered him nothing, no concession, neither on investment issues nor on the South China Sea issue. And it is only then that you see Marcos Jr. beginning to take a very different stance on the South China Sea. Just weeks later, he's at the World Economic Forum. You can watch it on YouTube. He says one of the things that keeps him awake at night is thinking about the South China Sea. A week later, he decides to expand the parameters of Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement between the Philippines and United States. And more importantly, ahead of going to Japan, a month after visiting China, he says, we need a trilateral security partnership with Japan and the United States. So this was Marcos' way of saying, you don't respect me? We have no leverage with you? You think I'm just another Duterte? Forget about it. We're going to come back to you with more bargaining chip. So this is his way of adjusting the parameters of interaction with China. Very rational, very sensible, right? But at the same time, let's not forget, the Biden administration, a Democratic administration for that matter, also rolled out the red carpet for Marcos Jr. Immediately after he became the president, I'm just going to squeeze this in, Wendy Sherman, number 2 in State Department, was here in the Philippines and said, remember, the Marcoses have a lot of court cases in the United States, right? Some of them, he has contempt cases even, right? We're talking about huge, hundreds of millions of dollars maybe cases. And the US government has no control over that. But the US government made it clear to Marcos that you are going to have sovereign immunity whenever you visit the Philippines because you are the head of state. The rumor also is that maybe the Treasury Department is also not looking for the ill-gotten wealth in Cayman Islands or whatever, but I don't want to talk about that. Right? That the administration can control, but it's a long conversation. So just as US was giving Marcos everything he needed, and I think for Marcos, he was always worried how will the US Biden administration welcomed him, considering he's a Marcos, and the liberal opposition is saying this was cheated elections. But as soon as he saw the Americans embrace him, I think he felt confident. He was just waiting for the Chinese to make their move, and China didn't make its move. That was a mistake on the part of China. And the last part, of course, which is important, I don't want to even talk about ASEAN. I don't think it's worth even discussing them at this point in time, is the fallout with the Dutertes. In many ways, if you look at what's happening with the Dutertes nowadays, if you look at what's happening, so this piece of mine just came out of the Journal of Democracy. What's happening with the Dutertes is also kind of a proxy war. Because no offense, but the Dutertes, last time I checked, right, never criticize China whenever they do anything here. And sometimes they even portray China as a victim, right? I can go through all the quotes that, forget about Rodrigo, the sons, the daughter, and everything, or actually non-quotes from the daughter whenever there's a major incident in the South China Sea and bullying by China. And so in these upcoming elections, in midterm elections, both superpowers have an interest in one of these two parties, right? And China is really betting on the return of Dutertes. They look at the approval ratings of Sara, the highest. They look at their chances to become the next president. I think in China, some people are thinking, let's just wait out Marcos Jr. and wait for the Dutertes to come back. I think it's a wrong calculation, but that may explain why China is doing what it's doing. They're pressuring Marcos, they're hoping the Dutertes to come back, and they're hoping the Dutertes as early as now pressure the Marcoses. But last point, let's talk about the geopolitics too. Why is the Philippines very, very important? Because if you look at the Philippines, so this was the EDCA basis I was discussing and all. If you look at the Philippines, we're just next to Taiwan, right? So we are a frontline state, but Taiwan is a frontliner state, right? They're slightly even more trouble than us. And there's no way to defend Taiwan or deter Chinese invasion of Taiwan unless three countries are directly involved. The United States, obviously, but also Japan, which has military bases right to the north of Taiwan, and the Philippines, which has military bases right to the south of Taiwan. So this triangular security cooperation is extremely, extremely important. And that is why the Philippines is now central for the United States. They need the Philippines to be on board if they want to prevent an all-out war over Taiwan, which could create even a bigger conflict in this part of the world. And that explains the trilateral framework, that explains the new quadrilateral Squad cooperation, and that explains why behind the scenes, we and the Taiwanese are beginning to send feelers to each other, right? Even over Twitter. And as you know, Taiwan is extremely important, not only because of having fantastic food and people, also because 90% of the most advanced semiconductors in this world that are running everything that we're doing right now are made in TSMC, or at least by one of those major Taiwanese companies. Now, the Philippines, speaking of juicing, not choosing, I think the strategy for the Philippines is to have optimal involvement on the Taiwan issue, meaning be open to the idea of American and Japanese presence in the north of the Philippines, but not too much. Leverage that to get something out of the Chinese. Essentially, the deal is this. Tell to the Chinese, if you bully us in the South China Sea, we'll give Americans more access in the north of the Philippines vis-a-vis Taiwan. You hurt us here, we hurt you there. The more you hurt us here, the more American missile systems are going to go there. Therefore, when Americans send the Typhoon missile systems to Balikatan exercise, the Chinese were panicking. Because the game really on Taiwan is, if Japan and the Philippines establish more and more missile defense systems, it will be harder for China to invade Taiwan. So that's why the Philippines is becoming very, very important to American strategy in this part of the world. And that is why Japan also just signed a reciprocal access agreement, a defense agreement of its own with the Philippines, because they want the two of us also to coordinate more, including on Taiwan. Not solely, but including on Taiwan. Obviously, there's pushback. There are some pro-China governors, the sister of the current president, the Dutertes. So a lot is happening in the Philippines. But I think that raises questions for us. What should the Philippines do? So this is the last part, I'm just going to cut it. EDCA. So with respect to Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, this little bases, actually it's not bases, facilities we're allowing the Americans to have access to. What is the end goal here? Some would say it's provoking China. Some are saying it's about deterring China. I think that's a debate we should have. For me, I think the devil is in the details. It depends how much access Americans will have. It depends on how many sites are we going to open up to the Americans. It depends on what is the location of those sites. Is it really about the West Philippine Sea and South China Sea? Is it about Taiwan? Is it about terrorism? So the devil is in the details, and that's the kind of conversation we should have in this country. Not, this is anti-China or this is pro-US. No, it's about how, what kind of portfolio mix you should have, right? To make sure that we can defend our national interest. It goes without saying that diplomacy is the way forward, but diplomacy on what terms? Because if you engage in diplomacy with China without any leverage, That's surrender, right? So I asked my friend, when you say, let's just diplomacy this with China, Duterte did that for 6 years. What on earth did he get from China? It just got more militarization, more harassment, Gember incident, Reed Bank, Juan Felipe incident 2021 with Sunreef, and no investments, no major investments from China. Show me a single big-ticket Chinese infrastructure investment in the Philippines. Please, I can't see any. Not the beautification Pasig River project or something like that, or that there was this ridiculous bridge project in Rockwell where I used to live, whereby it's like the bridge is like, I don't know, 8 lanes, but before you go to the bridge, it's like 2 lanes. So it's like you're super fast inside, but you're also slow here. And it was just a ridiculous project. And it was like Chinese workers, Chinese companies, they just made money on their own, right? So that's not big ticket infrastructure investment. What Japan is doing, building subways, what Japan is doing, NLEX and all of those are big ticket infrastructure projects, investments. We're not getting that from China. So when we talk about diplomacy, it has to be on a basis where we have a bargaining chip, because China respects strength. And if you cannot have that strength on our own, we have to build that strength, strengthening our own military capabilities. We're going to put $35 billion over the next 10 years in that. But that's also where allies come in. It's not that US cares about the Philippines per se. Of course, US also cares about its national interest. But we have a convergence of interest with the US. We have a convergence of interest with Japan to push back against China. And that's the context of our alliances and all of that. As I said, it is good in theory to say, let's be more like Vietnam. But remember, Vietnam had how many decades of war, half a century of war before they get there. Oh, and remember, it's a communist country, right? You talk about India, they have 10, 15 times our size in terms of economy, in terms of population. Is it really possible to replicate what India has been doing vis-a-vis China, etc.? I think there are lessons we can learn here and there, and we don't have time for this, I'm already way over time. I think we can look at South Korea and Turkey, 2 US allies who have been more effective in managing the relationship with multiple superpowers. But nevertheless, we should not forget our geography dictates our foreign policy. We are a frontline state. We are sandwiched in between these 2 theaters of maritime competition between the 2 superpowers. And accordingly, we have to step up to the plate. I think it's enough of having discussion of whether you're Team US or Team China. It has to be about Team Philippines. On that note, thank you very much and looking forward to your violent reactions and criticisms. Salamat. Thank you.